Good evening, friends and colleagues, please. We now proceed to our second keynote speech of this wonderful seminar after great talk we have today from Professor Steve Livingston. And I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Lance Bennett, our honored guest and keynote speaker tonight, who I just say that, as you know, he is Lawrence Professor of Communication at the University of Washington, as well as Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington, and Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and Communication. And he, on a personal note, he has been one of the people who has inspired me in studying communication and power. And the book that he wrote with Steve Livingston as well, on When the Press Fails, relying on the analysis of the Iraq War and other, has been one of the key sources of thinking in my book, Communication and Power. They are fully credited. And by the way, they also commented on my manuscript. So it's not by accident that they are our two keynote speakers tonight, and it's a deep intellectual respect for the two of them. And certainly, Lance, we are so pleased and honored that you give us the first taste of your new book about the logic of connective action, which is in fact what we are all working out at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I need the rest of that too. So can I propose, first of all, that we raise our glasses, whatever they may contain, and thank our wonderful hosts, Peter and Janet and Manuel and Nosh and Amanda, for doing such a great job of organizing us disruly folk, and for bringing together such a charming bunch with so many interesting ideas. I say here's to all of us. Good. I love that sound. It's a wonderfully cheerful sound. So this project, this is actually a participant observation project. This is my co-author and I taking notes at a demonstration. We're thinking of using this as the cover for the book. And I'm sorry that Alexandra Segerberg can't be here tonight to share this moment and the presentation. But we're nearing the finish of this project, so I'm going to present some of what I think of as the highlights of our theory and some of the data, just a taste of the data. But I began seeing different kinds of collective action from the WTO Seattle protests and onward. There were certainly emergent forms of it before Seattle WTO, but the idea of inclusive and diverse networks of networks of networks began to strike me as an interesting departure from social movement collective identity formations. And the question of what to call these things, Mario and I have had a long-running conversation about what do you call this stuff. And it could be that maybe we should move beyond that. Richard suggested on the bus this afternoon, why are you worrying about this terminology? I just call it discourse formats. That's what we should call it. And I almost canceled this entire talk as a result of that conversation, but I'm going to press on. So if you flash forward 10, 11, 12 years from WTO, you begin getting Tahrir Square, the Indignados, Occupy, the Icelandic uprising, which I believe was the first, actually, of all of these, which was a very interesting collective action formation. And they seem to be large-scale, rapid, contentious politics that really don't have all the defining characteristics of social movements. And so the only reason I want to worry about defining our terms is because I think there's a theoretical nugget that we might be able to tease out if we think about what these terms actually mean. So one of my favorite examples is indeed the Indignados. I was lucky enough to be in Barcelona twice last year while there were big protests going on. And this is Madrid, actually. But it became very clear that the Democracia Realia formation was an interesting formation because it was very much like Occupy, very much like some of these other large-scale protests in the sense that they weren't organized in the way we have come to think of social movements being organized. So I want to present a bit of data. There are a couple of data slides, but they're kind of interesting data slides, so I'm using that as my best premise for sharing data with you. And I'm deeply indebted to colleagues in Spain, Eva Anduiza, Camila Cristancho, Jose Sabucedo, who are also colleagues of Bruce's. In fact, Bruce connected me with them. And they've been doing surveys of the sort that Sasha wanted to do before the evictions, of actually going into protests and using a method that we've developed. Mario has done in Italy, and I've done in the US, and there's a series of social movement scholars around Europe and North America going into protests and doing sampling and getting surveys in the hands of demonstrators. And they've done this, and interestingly enough, they have done it with 4 conventional social movements. There was a general strike. There were 2 regional autonomy demonstrations and a pro-life demonstration, and they did it with the May 15th indignados. And they shared their data. Yes?
What is it? 15M?
That's May 15th. That's the name of the original mass mobilization. And so think of these as the indignados here. And what's interesting to me is, so I extracted these 3 bits of data. First of all, to the extent that people identified with any organizations, and Mario, I think we need to get beyond thinking of members. We're in the post-membership age. So, but to the extent that people could name organizations that they identified with, 70 to 100% of the social movement demonstrations had street addresses. That's an interesting, unobtrusive measure. Only 30% of the named organizations of the indignados had street addresses. This one actually is equally interesting. Of the organizations named, many of these organizations without street addresses, as you might guess, were just websites. Those are organizations. So we're 3 years on average old, whereas the social movement organizations named were between 10 and 43 years on average of age. And could you join the organizations? Back to the idea of membership. What's the relationship between people and these networks? Well, you can actually join in 60 to 100% of the social movement organizations that were named, and only 13% of the named indignados organizations enabled membership, which I think are fundamentally interesting kinds of property shifts. Yeah.
Was there interest in joining an organization?
No, it just said, could you join? Does the organization...
That was like even matters that they
Right.
join.
Do you think you could join this organization? Does this organization offer membership opportunities? And, you know, joining a website is kind of an afterthought. So these are, I think, someone asked earlier today, what's new here? I don't like the question, what's new, because it's an endlessly impossible question. But different. I think we can say, what are some of the things that are different here? And I think these are interesting differences. So let me take you on a one-slide tour of the last 30 years of global history. Okay, this is the next bit here. And so what's happened in the last 30 years to enable this shift in the way protest politics is being organized? One thing is that many of us have talked in different ways about individuation. My flavor of preference for this is Giddens and Ulrich Beck. There are a lot of people talking about individuation. Pick your favorite flavor of that theory. And Manuel actually in the 90s talked about the shift from group-based to network societies. So we should honor Manuel's thinking about that. The result of which, though, is very interesting in terms of moving from a kind of socially structured party and movement-based politics where you can join organizations, where you do have commitments to issues and so on, to a very personalized and individualized kinds of political identification perhaps with the same issues. You might care just as much about the environment as anyone who joined an environmental organization did, but you don't join the environmental organization. And the resource available to most of these individuals who are still interested in political affiliation is digital media, from cell phones of the sort that Steve talked about this afternoon to computers and other platforms.
So sorry. What do you mean? What is the difference between a group-based and network-based society?
Well, for example, my favorite example is how this neoliberal global economic regime created the kinds of political pressures, and you all know the story of corporations changing business models and moving production offshore, threatening labor markets at home, pressing left social labor parties to produce market reforms in most of European nations. The result of that is that the left, as a party structure, has been on the run for the last 15 years after the left parties in Spain, in Germany, in Sweden, of all places, began to introduce market reforms in those societies, thereby cutting loose their own political base, moving to the center, and losing members. So the most popular political identification in Sweden, of all places today, is none of the above. 50% of Swedish voters under 30 today have no party preference, but they do join in networks of communication, the Pirate Party, and other kinds of political affiliations that have become very central and meaningful to them as political citizens. So it's that movement. The left party is in the wilderness in Germany and Sweden, all over Europe. Was blamed, I think, in Spain for many of the austerity measures. They introduced many of the austerity measures. And yet, large-scale political networks begin to attract individuals who are still concerned about politics in the way parties and unions and churches and other kinds of social organizations attracted people 20, 30 years ago. Does that help? Good. So anyway, we've lost the coherence on the left. Neoliberalism has become a sort of the default ideology of our time. Wendy Brown calls it sort of the rationalizing discourse that is sitting above ideologies, which I think is an interesting way of thinking about how neoliberalism has become rationalized so that people don't even think of it so much as an ideology, but really as a sensible way. It's almost like a state of nature. But what's interesting about that state of nature is that it wasn't static, and over this period of globalization produced sweeping growth in inequality, among other things, but particularly sweeping growth in inequality in the US and the UK. But even in places like Sweden, inequality is beginning to ratchet up to the point where the OECD issued a report on inequality and whether it poses a threat to democracy. Manuel raised the question of whether the legitimacy of democracy is in question today, and I think the answer is yes, because inequality is a fundamental threat to the conduct of a democratic society. If you have to ask yourself why, you have accepted, without knowing it perhaps, neoliberalism as your way of life. But I'll be happy to talk about why inequality and democracy are bad companions. Steve has been provoking me for some time. He said, okay, so now you've explained the northern hemisphere in the last 30 years in 3 bullet points, and that's great. But what about the rest of the world? What about the authoritarian regimes of North Africa? What about the stateless societies that Steve has been visiting in Africa? And so I think, since I want to create the comprehensive theoretical statement in one slide, I've got a bullet point for authoritarian regimes. And what's interesting is that many of the authoritarian regimes that actually had successful networked uprisings, Tunisia and Egypt among them, had really lost much of their civil society formation due to police state. I mean, the Egyptian uprising began, after all, as the beating death of a young activist who was contesting police brutality. And he was dragged out, and government corruption, and police corruption. He was dragged out in an unusual moment and actually beaten to death in public. His relatives were so horrified when they claimed his body at the morgue, and usually these people are just disappeared, so this was a rare case. And the photographs taken by his brother then became the We Are All Khalid Khalid Saeed Facebook page. So I think that you have an interesting parallel condition of individualized citizens with, in many cases, the cases where the revolutions were successful, access to technology. So what about the failed states? Also, you have socially isolated citizens who are in many cases digitally connected. So the actual social change forces may be different, but you get similar outcomes, similar states of readiness, I would argue, for large-scale political networks to form. Okay, so there's the prologue. And here's the hard theory. And I'm going to wave my hands at these things because this is like an eye chart for those of you in the back room, and it's too late to worry about too much of this depth. But I've begun to see, Alex and I have begun to see sort of three ideal type kinds of collective action formation. One is the old social movement style where you have coalitions that Mario was talking about and brokered kinds of coalitions that lead to the formation, if successful, of collective identifications. We all share the same story about what's the problem and what to do about it, or we're working toward sharing the same story about what's the problem, what to do about it. Because people are less inclined to join organizations as members, as strong, committed identifiers with a cause that requires them to change their personal identity commitments, what I'm beginning to see is that in a lot of cases there's a hybrid emerging in which there are social movement or NGO organizations, and for those of you who are familiar with the alphabet soup of this whole literature, what's an NGO, what's an SMO, get over it. It's, you know, on Tuesday it's an NGO, on Thursday it's an SMO. And the organization doesn't see a problem. We see a problem of trying to classify them. And that's because these organizations behave as hybrids and often recognize that they can't require people to behave as members, but they can attract people if the organization steps back from the cause, still the same cause, the organization steps back and deploys social media to enable individuals to tell their stories about why they're concerned about the environment, why they're concerned about economic justice. Doesn't require an identity shift and doesn't require joining an organization, but people may appreciate that organizations are using their resources to help mobilize them about a cause. And then the third ideal type that we're seeing more of is the Tahrir Square, the Indignados, the Occupy, the Icelandic uprising, in which it's more or less self-organizing. There are organizations in the mix, but they are so far in the background, and they're often policed out. The interesting thing about many of these self-organizing movements is that they are able to organize rather high levels of tasking, such as policing out other organizations that want to take them over, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, unions in Spain. I mean, unions in Spain and parties in Spain were regarded as part of the problem and were pushed out of the protests in Madrid and Barcelona and 100 other cities. So these three ideal types, the traditional social movement collective action, this hybrid form, now you see it, now you don't, organizations stepping back, promoting individual engagement on personal terms and self-organizing. Sometimes these can be dominant in one event or one protest. Sometimes they all occur together, and you get an analytical challenge because you have to look to see how these three types are playing out. So the thing that I'm beginning to see is that where a lot of social movement theory was concerned about all of these conditionalities for social organization, because of Mansur Olson's classic collective action problem, where organizations were required both to provide leadership and resources to broker differences and to spend money and to hire professional staff who knew how to organize, who knew about the issues involved. and to figure out what's our story as a collectivity, digital media come into play, but they often don't change the game. They reduce costs. You know, Bruce, you wrote a book early on about political parties and elections in which you found that it didn't change the game. I mean, there was some cost saving, but it was sort of, the digital media was sort of worked into the existing bureaucratic order. And then you looked at a post-bureaucratic world in which digital media was quite a different animal, which is what we're picking up from. We're beginning to see a different kind of logic at work in these other two collective action formations. And that is that personal content travels because it's self-motivating. The free rider problem isn't a problem. Free rider problem says you have to sacrifice something of your personal interest to join a collectivity to produce a public good. And the free rider says, I'm going to let the collectivity deliver the public good, and I will benefit from it. The self-motivated activist says, I've got a story to tell, and it's nice that I have social media to tell it to so many other people who seem to be interested in hearing it. And so the technology enables people to not just sit with their own personal stories, but to share them often over really, really large networks of other people. So in this form of collective action, communication is the organization. I'm just going to put it out there like that. Some people may rankle at the idea of communication as organization, but I'm going to go ahead, since something has to keep us awake here tonight. So have at this claim that what we have here is not just communication enhancing some of the functions of organization, but in fact as organization. Content matters in this world. And this is where collective identity, I'm glad you woke up, Mario, because that was perfect, really perfect timing. Because what I want to argue is that there are two kinds of identity frames in these types of collective action. There are personal identity frames, which is I get to tell my own story about social injustice, about environmental problems. And the frames that enable me to tell the story are really easy to accommodate almost everybody within. So we are the 99% is the why don't you tell your own story now frame. But that's not a collective action frame of the sort social movement scholars have invited us to think of as collective action frames. So collective action frames, by contrast, require identity shifts. Let's tell our story, and that requires some shift in our emotional placements and also maybe the sacrifices we have to make. Social media, as I said, are what enable these stories to travel far and wide. So there's a different logic here. So if there's something really new, it's this, that there's a different theoretical foundation. And my debts here go far and wide, so I could fill this thing with citations, and if you want to see all the citations, read the book. I promise, though, as many of them as I can think of will be in there. And in this formation, digital media actually can change the game. They don't always, because not all of these things work, not all of them take off. And it's an interesting story about which ones do and which ones don't, and under what conditions they become successful. So just to review the types, so there's the self-organizing networks, and here's the Khalid Said Facebook page, which was still an important organizational hub long into this uprising. Yeah.
Just to know, can I go back to sleep again, or is the same?
I tell you, you got about 3 minutes for a cat nap, and then I'm going to wake you up again, because the really important example of what's different between a personal action frame and a collective action frame is coming up in about 3 minutes. So, okay. So this is an interesting example of a node in a self-organizing network that I think you're all familiar with. You know, the Occupy has provided really fascinating kinds of self-organization through really dense networks. This is Mark Smith's kind of iconic 26 minutes of an Occupy Twitter stream, which is all that his software could handle, but it's pretty intense for 26 minutes. And as you can see, the tweets for Occupy have run into the hundreds of thousands and indeed millions. Now, some of these 100,000 hashtags are things like Occupy Chipotle or Occupy Britney. So they're not all crucial to the cause. Sesame Street. Exactly. On the other hand, a lot of these hashtags are doing interesting kinds of crowd work that we can talk about later if you want to. And they also carry links. I mean, one of the things that we're doing is beginning to code link content and then drop the links back into streams, sort of like tagging salmon and seeing where they swim in these vast Twitter streams. Because if this is an organization, or if this and all of the Facebooks and all of the websites running through it constitute an organization, one of the defining qualities of organizations seems to me that they mobilize resources, right? That's what they do for us. So what kinds of resources do social networks mobilize? Well, lots of things: trust and affection and friendship and so on, and stolen music and films and all of that. But they also begin to share resources that are sometimes vital for the next moves of a protest, for the survival of a protester, for help on the way to an earthquake. And so the link patterns and the way in which they flow seem to me to be interesting things to study. But among the links are things that are highly personal. So one of the things that we've discovered, and I think that the paper at the end of the day with Gilad and Dana and company suggested that it's amazing how much personal communication is going on and how much personal small networking is going on in these information flows. And here's one that we've followed for a time in the G20 protests. At the beginning of the economic crisis in 2009, there were protests around the world, everywhere the G20 went to meet about what to do about the crisis. Protesters greeted them. They were waiting in London, they were waiting in St. Andrews, they were waiting in Toronto, in Pittsburgh, which was kind of such a disaster that the Daily Show parodied it, and it was very, very funny. Seoul and so on. And a lot of the links that we looked at pointed to personal stories. So this is a blogger named Lego Festo who blogs in Legos. And this is the scene, and she's blogged about Abu Ghraib and about a lot of social justice situations around the world. And this is her blog post about a death in the London G20 protests in 2009 of an innocent person who wasn't even a demonstrator who was killed by police. And she actually became a kind of popular blogger, both in terms of people looking at this and getting a different kind of message than you might have gotten from a highly political, blog about police violence. Also, people were debating about, is blogging in Legos a valid form of blogging? And Time Magazine did a feature on her and so on. So there are lots and lots of comments. Wherever her link popped up, people were commenting in large numbers. So none of this is to discount the importance of human agency in this sizable gathering. Just to emphasize that, I want to make sure that we're not. And some people, by the way, I don't know how, but some people have gotten angry about this talk or earlier versions of this talk on grounds that it is privileging social media too much and human blood, sweat, and tears too little. Camping, for weeks is no picnic, okay? On the other hand, the sustainability of this entire enterprise would be unlikely without the social media networks that have kept people in touch and activate the rhizomic next events that we've seen. So while I don't want to, underplay human agency, I don't want to overplay it either, and we can debate that. And yes, there are some social movement activists in this crowd, but I'm going to show you some different crowd pictures in just a minute, and you'll see that when social movements show up as welcome members of a crowd, they look and act differently. Very, very differently. Okay, just in case there's anyone here who doesn't think I'm giving it enough attention. So the middle model, this hybrid case of NGOs and SMOs and other organizations who've decided to step back and put social media forward so individuals can engage with the same issue on their own terms rather than on collective identity terms. This is an interesting example from the London, the largest of several London protests when the G20 first started its series of meetings around the economic crisis. What's interesting here is this is sort of like what a social movement looks like. They all are wearing the same vests, dressed in the same way. They have a collective identity, these guys down here in yellow. But if you notice all the different banners, everybody came with different banners and many handmade signs in the crowd, and there was no common statement, there was no common theme other than this really general put people first theme, which is kind of like we are the 99%. Who are we? We are people. And what do we want? Put people first. Not just us, but everybody who's being exploited by this neoliberal system. And the NGOs stepped back, put up a website called Put People First, which was its own organization. If you asked a lot of people in this crowd, what's your organization? It might have been World Wildlife or it might have been Oxfam, but a lot of them would have said, Put People First is my organization. And what did I do with my organization? I told my story. So the front page of this website invited people to send their personal messages to the G20. And thousands of personal messages went to the G20 and scrolled on this website for months and indeed for more than a year afterwards. So if you look at the network behind that protest there, it looks like this. I mean, this looks kind of like a social movement network that's got brokered relationships, and you could call it a coalition, except for it doesn't display those other properties that we often associate with coalitions. But as I said, this is Tuesday. And on Tuesday, it's looking like a hybrid in which the organizations have stepped back, deployed batteries of social technology to invite people to tell their personal stories. On Thursday, the action taken by this UK economic justice network might look more like a social movement in which they're doing something very organized. And on next Monday, it might look like a issue advocacy interest network doing business with government. And none of those is contradictory for these organizations. It's only contradictory for us as scholars trying to understand them. So then there are social movements in that same crowd. So this crowd also contained little clusters of these people. So this is the World Development Movement group, and they all have printed signs. They've got their monster that they take to protests, and they are all sharing the same message. So this is an example of collective identity being displayed in the very same crowd. Only this was not the typical group in the crowd. This group could have been in that crowd, except that they wanted to ride to the Bank of England as the four horsemen of the economic apocalypse and cause some trouble. These were the anarchists. So the NGOs said, well, wait a minute, we've got a message called Put People First. We want individuals to tell their stories, and we want the press to understand that message clearly. So in this demonstration, the NGO coalition brokered a deal, so there was some brokering going on behind the scenes, so that they invited the anarchists to join them, but on Put People First terms. And if they wanted to break windows and ride into the Bank of London as the four horses of the economic apocalypse, that's fine, but do it on Friday, okay? Because our demonstration is on Wednesday. And that's how it worked. It didn't work that way in Pittsburgh, and so you had total chaos, and all kinds of these ideal types of collective action came into play at the same time. So, Mario, this is where you need to wake up again. Because the one thing I would like to do is continue our 2-year conversation now about identity. And we've been talking about this for a long time. And I think there's a difference between personal and collective action frames, and so I'm going to give you an example of 2 of my favorite ones of each. The personal action frame is basically a send your own message frame, and this is an example of the stories being told by the 99% that sort of were triggered by this Tumblr blog. I'm a student in debt trying to prove I can make it, trying to survive on nothing, trying to help my parents who work too much for too little, parents that immigrated for the American dream, but what American dream, and so on. And these are really moving stories, but they're really personal stories. Here, on the other hand, is a kind of a nice collective action frame that I like a lot. Eat the bankers, eat the rich. Okay? And that one takes a little bit more of an identity shift to really get behind. I mean, some days I feel like that, but not every day. I'm happier over here most days. And it's nice I live in a world where I can choose which identity I want to assume around my economic concerns. So let's look at, I mean, you all, is anyone here not familiar with memes? I mean, this crowd, everybody knows memes. Here's my extraction from Richard Dawkins. You can decide if I've extracted appropriately from Richard Dawkins. Dawkins was basically challenged, you know, and he's one of the great interpreters of biological science and evolution theory. Well, but where do cultures come from? How is it that if genes determine so much about human adaptation, how come we have this rainbow of different kinds of culture, that some of which don't seem highly functional even? So some of them might be maladaptive, witness ours. So how did Dawkins grapple with this idea of adaptive biological species that have sometimes really maladaptive cultural developments? And so he said that, you know, the meme is the equivalent of a gene on the culture side, and we have this biological capacity to imitate and to express, and then to adapt, imitate, and express again. And so it gets shared, and that's how things go viral. But there's 2 kinds of memes, okay? I mean, I know there's 2 kinds of everything in the world, but what I think is important is that people have, I almost abandoned the whole idea of memes because I thought they were really useless because, you know, they're kind of circular. Oh, how did that thing go viral? Oh, it was a meme. Well, then I got to thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe there are different kinds of memes that travel different ways and we can see the mechanisms that help them go. And so I thought, given this idea of personal action frames and collective action frames, maybe there's more inclusive personal memes that travel farther with less work because it's my story and I'm sharing it with you, and then you get to share your story with her. And that's how it goes. But it's all a story about the same thing, so it becomes a coherent experience. As opposed to collective action memes, which are like Eat the Rich, have been around for a long time, but in order to perpetuate them, you need a lot more cultural work. Cultural work like rituals, cultural work like songs, cultural work like protest routines that take that meme and explain how to appropriate it and share it and use it. So let's look at the cultural work involved in Eat the Rich, which I'm saying is a meme, but it's a collective action meme, and it takes, you know, patriotic memes are loaded with cultural work. National anthems, flag waving, we're #1 chants, all of that stuff that goes into making America the country where people believe they're #1, even though they're actually number 17, on a good day on most measures. That's culture. That's culture at work. So Eat the Rich. From one of my favorite writers, actually came this little bon mot. JJ himself, when the people shall have nothing more to eat, they will eat the rich. How did that get, I mean, this would be an interesting book to write, is how did this thing travel through history from this moment to Aerosmith and their iconic album called Eat the Rich. There was a lot of cultural work going on in Aerosmith, transmitting the Eat the Rich meme to a headbanger audience on a large scale. So suddenly Aerosmith produces an album, and the headbangers of the world are suddenly radicalized around this really collective identity frame. Because I'm sick of your complaining about how many bills, and I'm sick of all your bitching about your poodles and your pills. I just can't see no humor about your way of life. And I think I can do more for you with this here fork and knife. And then the chorus is kind of, well, eat the rich, eat the rich. There's only one thing there.
Can you sing it?
Mario's going to sing it. We'll do a duet. Banksy got in the act. Banksy is, I think, one of our great contemporary artists. If you haven't seen the movie Exit Through the Gift Shop, see it. It's fabulous. And so this is a Banksy takeoff, and he puts an asterisk after Rich said, with our new 2-for-1 offer, including choice of wine. And then Eat the Rich Bar and Grill, one of my favorite dining establishments, and Eat the Rich T-shirts, and then it goes down to the street where somebody's putting it on a piece of cardboard. But it takes relatively more work to get that meme onto that piece of cardboard than it takes to get the 99% meme on a piece of cardboard. Yeah.
But once it gets to like the mainstream public, isn't it watered down and almost meaningless? I mean, I would kind of argue that like the Aerosmith album title, like
That's an
the
interesting
message is
question.
not the same as
It's an
when it
interesting
comes
question.
from like those who fervently believe in that message, as opposed to like co-opting that message to like sell out.
You know, and
Make
the
more
struggle.
money.
Who was it who earlier today said that they thought that Occupy had been totally perverted on the Virgin Air flight? Was it Sasha? Yeah. Who said that, yeah, I mean, so here is Occupy, and it's a stick figure for an investment program. So when it becomes totally diluted, which any symbol is, I mean, look at how much abuse freedom has suffered as a symbol. I mean, freedom of everything, freedom to drive in your car, freedom, I don't even want to talk about, freedom from underarm odors and all of that stuff. So you can actually put the edge back when you, make it an edgy statement again and return to guerrilla theater with it. And then you're inviting people to make a tougher choice, I think, in their adoption of Eat the Rich as a collective action frame than maybe Aerosmith. On the other hand, you got to sort of get cozy with memes somewhere, somehow, so you could also argue, I mean, this is where ethnography becomes your best friend, and you need to look at how these things actually travel, but it's studyable. So the 99% kind of was everywhere, on cardboard, on personal signs, and it sort of whirled out of Tumblr with simple microblogs saying, tell your story as one of the 99%. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these really, really impressive, poignant stories that you can look at like this. I'm 20 years old, I can't find a job because I have no experience. I have no experience because I can't find a job. I'm the 99%. And they're all different, but they're all under the same general theme. And then, of course, it got dressed up, and there's the Occupied Wall Street Journal and pins and so on. So it traveled far and wide. It traveled around the globe. 99% turns out to be a meme that crosses borders very easily, and people adopt in different contexts. Here's it traveling to Australia. And here's an interesting example of the personalization of relationships to large connectivities. Most websites have a tab that says, who are we? This one has a tab that says, who are you? And basically it says, don't ask about us, this is about you, which is a really interesting way of flipping the whole relationship question of who am I joining? Well, you're joining yourself, and that's really a fundamental ethos of Occupy, isn't it? Is you decide what to do, you decide who to do it with, and if you can get enough other people to do it with you, we've got a large-scale protest. And this revolution was tweeted as well. And indeed, the tweeting is the voice, in many ways, of of, I think, these protests. Okay, so I want to finish by saying, all right, so there's a way of setting up a theoretical understanding of different formations of collective action that may dominate particular situations, one or the other, or they may all co-occur. And that's for us to decide analytically. But what about the effectiveness of these forms? Because there's been a lot of challenge to connectivities that they're not organized, they're not hierarchical, they don't have resources, they can't go on. So we have done a study comparing the hybrid model of connectivities, where there are organizations that do have resources, that do network with each other, with the large-scale self-organizing networks. So I want to talk about power networks for a minute. And in particular, I want to talk about these two forms. Do forms of connective action that have organizations that on one day begin to look like SMOs and NGOs, and on another day they step behind a campaign and deploy social media, is this necessarily more effective in terms of political outcomes that you could think of than these self-organizing, even if large-scale networks? So what's power? Okay, here is a very quick and dirty definition of power. Buy it if you like it, challenge it if you will. But basically, the capacity to shape outcomes. But there's a lot of different outcomes. And so the outcome I've settled on, because I found a way of comparing it across different kinds of networks, or I think we have, is do these collective action formations that are based on the different logic have the capacity to basically set elite agendas, which is maybe a first step toward political change? You know, Obama, and I'm giving away some of the punchline here, Obama is beginning to sound like he's concerned about inequality. Interesting, after it had been the dirty little secret of the global era for so many years. And I'm going to show you how Obama got close to that idea with the help of Occupy. But here's the research question, is do networks with steep power curves actually have more capacity to affect these kinds of changes than relatively flat distributed networks of the sort we think of when we think of Occupy, or at least I do. So that's the question.
So Lance, can I just interject one thing about your definition? So it seems like that definition of power is the definition of power among the powerless. But among people who have power, the definition of power is the capacity to have the outcomes come out the way you want without having to make it happen.
And so power is a many-splendored thing. And I'm not studying the 1% here, but if I were studying the 1%, I guess I would be worrying more about that, and I would be worrying more about how to defuse Occupy than Occupy, is worrying about, how to get the powerful to adopt its agenda. But at the end of all this, I want to come back to your question, because it's a really interesting one about what does the 2.0 version of any of these collective formations look like in systems that are unresponsive? Okay? Because the system actually has, this is the legitimacy question. I mean, should the indignados form a political party? Well, and become a minority inside a corrupted system? I think they might be better off staying where they are. And similarly with Occupy. They might court the vote of Obama, but they have to discipline him enough to address their issues. And then Obama's question is, how many millions in campaign contributions am I going to forego if I talk about their issues? And he's already discovered that he's going to lose a lot. I mean, and so those are the kinds of trade-offs that those in power have to make. So the research question, but thanks for that. It's a great question. Do networks with steeper power curves end up being more effective? And so I'm going to look at sort of a heads model and a tails model of different connective action, the hybrid and the self-organizing versions of connective action. So we've looked at a number of networks that look like that nice sort of social movement network that I showed you the picture of, the UK Social Justice Network. We've looked at economic justice, climate change, and women's policy networks in 3 countries, and a little bit in the US. And we've also looked at, Peter, you've been bugging me for a couple of years about, you know, if you would just get up with some more network statistics, you could compare the signatures of networks better. And I respect your concern for my methodological failings. But and I wanted to have this conversation, so let's have it now. Why not? Here's what I keep thinking, though, is that what if there are different kinds of network signatures than structural holes and dyadic, you know, differences and so on. And I think what we've done is decided that networks can either deploy mechanisms, digital mechanisms, to engage publics or not. And this gets back, Steve, to your question about are all of these NGOs not doing their jobs well? And what we've been finding is that some NGOs are not doing their jobs well on these issues in these countries. Other NGOs seem to be doing their jobs well on these issues in some of these countries. And what seems to be the signature difference is that the NGOs that seem to be effective are those that can actually move between hybrid states and more conventional social movement states, and move only because they deploy large batteries of social media to enable people to personalize their relations to the issues. So we can measure 35 different kinds of digital and social media on each of the nodes in that network and score the entire network. So we actually have developed a signature in terms of public engagement for networks, which is a different kind of signature that we can compare networks systematically in terms of. So anyway, I just wanted to catch up on that discussion. So yeah, and I'm looking forward to your reaction because I know you'll ask me another question that I'm going to think about for a year. But and then there's the tails thing. Is do these really distributed networks of networks of networks of the sort that you two are studying that have relatively few conventional organizations in their mix, and indeed often police conventional organizations out, like the unions in Spain, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, are they able to shape outcomes like public and elite discourses on similar issues of the sort that we have also measured with these hybrid networks? Okay, so those are the two, the heads and the tails. So let's go back to the heads. Sorry about that. So this is an economic justice network that Kimberly is familiar with, the Fair Trade Network in the UK. But it's an organizational network of high stability, long-standing, that includes Oxfam, KFAW, the Fair Trade Foundation, and also has a number of running campaigns, sort of world poverty campaigns and development campaigns and so on. And so we did 2 tests of power in this network, the capacity to shape elite discourse and outcomes. One was an interesting case study of the Robin Hood tax. Does anyone know what the Robin Hood tax is? Has anyone heard? It's the idea of a tax on financial transactions. The question is, what do you do with that tax and why are you taxing financial transactions? The sort of credit default swaps would be a great target for a financial transaction tax. Okay, quick story, and this is kind of a fun story. A Nobel laureate named James Tobin proposed this tax in the 70s, not because he was a radical, he was a classic neoliberal economist. But the Bretton Woods financial regime that was sustained by a gold standard that was no longer working in the world came to an end in 1971, I believe. Tobin said, look, this is going to lead to rampant currency speculation, financial trading that is unproductive economically. Sound familiar? So he got that part right, that we would eventually end up with a lot of economic exchanges that were only involving making money but didn't return anything productive to the societies in which those exchanges occurred. So he proposed a financial transaction tax that became known as the Tobin tax to discourage that kind of speculative trading. Now, it turns out that in the end of the 90s, when these kinds of exchanges were not only beginning to occur, but occur with alarming regularity, an economist in Le Monde Diplomatique said, let's do the Tobin tax as a way of discouraging pure speculation that is really ramping up economic injustice, especially in the southern world. And let's take that money that we've extracted from these speculators and use it for environmental protection, for economic justice causes, for development in the South. Well, it turns out Tobin didn't like that. Never mind that the World Social Forum was all abuzz with it, and that ATTAC, an organization that was early on important in the World Social Forum movement, adopted it as its early leading cause. Tobin basically says, I'm not with these people. Finally, after, it's interesting, crowds take a while to rename themselves and their causes. They can do it, but it doesn't happen overnight. A social movement can do it more quickly because they're meeting and brokering and working out deals. So by the early 2000s, this economic justice network had decided, okay, if Tobin doesn't want us, we will take his idea and rename it, and so it was renamed as the Robin Hood tax, taking from the rich, giving to the poor. So what's interesting is that over 10 years, this tax sort of was a small little campaign in that really dense economic justice network. And then a number of those big organizations said, let's make this a success. Let's use all of our resources, because we are on Tuesday interest organizations that have access to government leaders, so we'll do that. On Thursday, we're a social movement that can mobilize thousands of people in the streets. We'll do that. And on Fridays, we're going to actually put this out there as a freestanding campaign, not branded by any of us, called the Robin Hood Tax Campaign website. And that's the organization that tens of thousands of citizens in the UK came to know as their organization. Back to how is it that you can have an organization that's 2 years old, that doesn't let you be a member, and that only wants you to tell your personal story? Well, it happened. And if you go to the Robin Hood Tax site, you get to tell your personal story, and then you put in your postal code, and your personal story goes down into a little Robin Hood cap on the map. And you can drill into those Robin Hood caps and hear all of the stories. So what happened over this 10-year period is that even the Pope endorsed the Robin Hood tax by that name. Sarkozy, suddenly, as the economic crisis worsens, people you wouldn't necessarily think would associate themselves with this kind of an idea, Angela Merkel, Bill Gates, Sarkozy, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So last December, the Christmas sermon of the Archbishop of Canterbury talked about the disintegration of British society and the need for social trust and justice. And then he resigned and went to Oxford. But that was his swan song. And at that moment in time, this is a semantic network of the British online media, news and blogs. And in December, I did a 30-day look at that network and found 185 news items and 24 blogs that associated the Robin Hood tax with other things. And it's interesting, it was closely associated with the G20, with Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, with taxes, of course, with the European Union, which was one association removed, with Tobin, because a lot of columnists had to explain that this is where the idea came from, but he's dead and he didn't like it before he died. With David Cameron, who opposed it, because Cameron said that, well, this will take banking out of London. But suddenly there was a lively debate involving elites on this issue after 10 years of NGOs hybridizing their involvement. So I thought, that's interesting. So how many other campaigns are there on that same economic justice network that I showed you the map of? We inventoried that network for all of the campaigns. There were 21 of them running at the time we looked into all of those websites, of 45 websites. And it turns out that the in-link ranking of sites correlated highly with the number of news items featuring that campaign in the British press. So there's a statement about power in the heads of networks, I think. And we also found the same pattern for climate change. So we have a climate change network that looks rather like that. We looked at the in-link rankings of the sites in the network, the campaigns that they were sponsoring, and there was a high correlation between the in-link rankings of campaign sponsoring sites and press hits for those campaigns. So it seems like there's some power in the heads. So the tougher test is, what about the tails? Is there power in tails? And I'm almost done. So Mario, I'm almost done. So let's go back to this distributed and dynamic network. If you map it using Richard's wonderful issue crawler tool, what you always find is Twitter is the biggest node, Facebook is a big node, and social media are large nodes. But what are they really? They're not conventional organizations, they're dynamic, and if you drill into these things, you discover different features. Like Facebook is kind of a black hole. It's sometimes very important locally, but it doesn't sort of network nationally. Twitter is super important, but it's changing daily and hourly. And its relationship to the rest of the network is totally dynamic. So what does it mean to say that this network is like those NGO networks? So how do you represent this? 889 name accounts, at least 200 active hashtags, 250 Occupy websites, 450 Facebook pages, some of which are super active, 90% of which are active, some of which are super active, 244 live stream channels, on and on and on. That, to me, is the social backbone of Occupy, the communication backbone of Occupy. How do you represent it other than, let's just say, for the moment, that it's a distributed network? Now, we can talk about how you would know how distributed it is on a given day, and that would be an interesting discussion to have. But let's see if it's effective, however we want to model that network. In November, when Occupy was in its sort of adolescence, let's say, you could look at word associations in the US media, and I'm using Silo Breaker, which is kind of a quick and dirty but fun toy to sort of do checks on word associations in the media. And you discover that in November, going back a month, so October 20th, November 20th, the associations with inequality were Occupy and Adbusters, primarily, which kind of rings true to what we know about the origins of the inequality discourse. What's interesting is that the press picked the story up, which is another thing we might talk about. Then Occupy occupied Obama and the Democrats. You may recall that classic moment when Obama went to Wall Street with his hand out, and also to apologize for calling them fat cats. Imagine the shame of calling them fat cats. And Occupy was there to witness it. And the press not only picked it up, but witnessed it for all of us. And so the news was full of all of these Occupy the Democrats and Occupy Obama moments. I think that Obama and his team did some very fast marketing on how to deal with this inequality discourse, which seemed to be taking off without them. It's like, we're missing the plane here, folks. But do we want to be on that plane? Do we want to be associated with it? Do we want to be associated with it how? With recognition for Occupy, or leave them out of it, but we'll take their discourse. Thank you very much. So what happened is, he took the discourse, thank you very much, And he did it in the most daring and creative of ways. He channeled Teddy Roosevelt in a speech in Osawatomie, Kansas. Did any of you wonder, what's he doing in Osawatomie, Kansas? Well, that's where Teddy Roosevelt gave his great anti-corporate speech of 100 years ago. So suddenly, Obama moved from a distant afterthought. Obama wasn't even in this picture. His administration was mentioned at the very edge of the semantic network surrounding inequality a month before. And now, Obama and Occupy own, in equal distance, the inequality discourse space in the U.S. online media. And then he reinforced that with the State of the Union, in which he actually, this is Obama and Occupy, and these are inequality and Occupy and so on. And this is Obama and inequality, I'm sorry. So he took over the inequality discourse with his State of the Union message, and he seems to be keeping it going. Not identifying with Occupy, but taking that discourse as part of his campaign discourse strategy. So the idea here is that you have a relatively flat network that has accomplished quite a bit, and you have a relatively hierarchical network that also seems to have accomplished quite a bit. So where do we go from here? So what are the mechanisms that explain all of this? I mean, this has been pretty quick and dirty analysis, so we might want to get a little more fine-grained to figure out how all of this came to pass. But back to, and Manuel, it's nice that you're back, because this is the question I'm going to throw back to you.
We all seem to have a perfect time.
Okay.
Waking up.
No, you wake up at the right time. Manuel comes back in the room at the right time. It's perfect. So, but here's my question to all of you. So we've seen that there has been some success from different versions of connectivities, right? One that's relatively more centralized, one that's relatively more flat. But the question about the flat one is, does it want to become more centralized? Does it want to become more hierarchical? Does it want to become more organized? There seems to be an easy recommendation from the part of lots and lots of people, oh, the indignados need to get better organized. The Tahrir Square crowd needs to get better organized. Occupy needs to get better organized. Is that really your best move in a political system that is corrupted to the point that it isn't very responsive? Or is your best move to sit on the outside making politicians make difficult calculations? Do I give up campaign contributions and take over this issue that looks like it's got some popular support? And if the heat is kept on, is that maybe the best move to continue with? So I think that in many ways the system is broken. I mean, that's no secret. I'm not just laying my left-wing propaganda on you. The public opinion polls public opinion polls suggest that there are a lot of people who believe that in Spain, in the U.S., in Israel. So if the system is broken, is the flat, distributed, flexible, rhizomic organization maybe the best organizational form to have? And why would you want it to become like a social movement or like a political party? So that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. Yes.
For personal connotation, well, first of all, for me it's an extremely interesting topic because it really scholarly, analytical, and relevant. Because sometimes scholarly and relevant is not. And I'm not going to elaborate on the thing. I'm just going to try to answer directly to the point you made. In analytical terms and in empirical terms. In analytical terms, what we can say, if the system is broken, and I would add all the evidence to your evidence, means that the hierarchical, organized, programmatic organizations don't work. So we know what doesn't work.
Yeah, right.
And the rest is a question mark.
Yeah.
Okay? So at least the point is, can we see this evolving? And then there is a time sequence. It's a time sequence, and what I really think is that we should, if we would be seriously scholarly, we should start having a panel study over the years on a comparative basis to see how these networks evolve into something else. Because the others, certainly we know is not working. In the traditional sense, in legitimacy, in effectiveness, and actually in terms of policy making. I mean, the whole thing is going down the drain. In Europe was a dictatorship from the mer to sea, and suddenly there is only mer, not to sea, and next year, probably with the results today of German poll, Merkel is to retire. So therefore, things that appear to be so solid, so serious, in fact they are not. They are political conjunctures. So that's one, let's say, analytical research question. Let's make a panel. Let's see how these different forms of organization work. Different content will lead to different things. With all these negative things about how democracy works, we have counter stories. Iceland, as you said, I start my book with Iceland. Crowdsourcing a constitution is an interesting idea, right? And by the way, in terms of your allusion to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, how this eat the rich comes from, it comes from a commentary from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, aside from the Corsican Constitution of 1775 that he wrote, that became an inspiration for the American Constitution directly, which and an inspiration for the new Icelandic Constitution. So that's the connection throughout history in constitutional terms. Now, the other thing, in terms of the actual thing that works, doesn't work, it's possible, there is the observation of what is going on, the more normative question. I don't enter the normative question because, frankly, I think the movements decide by themselves, right? So, what is better or not for the movement depends which movement, when, how. What only thing I can report there is I mentioned a little bit this afternoon, is the current debate, like 3 days ago, in the Spanish Indignados movement. What's happening now? It's a group of people decided to register the trademark Real Democracy Now! In the Ministry of Interior as a non-profit association, leading the way to a political party.
Interesting.
It was a big explosion in the movement. People are starting to shout at each other, etc., etc. But mainly, the large majority of the movement met in different assemblies, and they had issued a statement yesterday. Yeah?
Interesting. Yes, so there's
Prime information. The statement says, who cares? The movement is everything. You want to a political party, do it. Other people will do other things. Networks of individuals will work. We will continue to demonstrate. We'll continue to do different things. On May 12th will be a global action day in which many networks around the world will do. And everybody does the same thing. Sorry, that's a different thing. But we all more or less agree.
Yeah.
You think that's the way? You do it. Is one of many other possibilities of the movement. Sign. Real Democracy Now! The idea, not the trademark.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's my point about
Yeah, so it's moving maybe toward 2.0, and we'll see what happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to add to, I wanted to comment your talk, simply 2 quick things. One, you have, I think it's important to integrate the viral character of the movement, the demonstration effect, if you want to say in economic terms, the viral character and the notion and the speed and diffusion of this movement. Example, illustration for after dinner talk. The capital of the Altai, as you know, is the Russian mountains close to Himalaya. 3 months ago, people were also indignados, also protesting against local corruption and everything, and individually, and had no organization. And they decided to occupy and demonstrate. Of course, the police were going to club them, imagine, in the Altai. But also how you occupy at minus 40 centigrade. A little practical problem. So every person in that town bought a plastic toy and created her own slogan and planted on the plastic toy. And when they had done, the main square of the city was full of hundreds and hundreds of plastic toys, with each one a different slogan, denouncing corruption with a specific case. The governor declared the state of emergency, saying, we do not acknowledge the right to demonstrate because first, they are toys, and second, most of them are foreign-made toys, so they are not Russian citizens.
Well, at least the governor had a sense of humor.
And related to this, I think a very important thing that comes clearly from your talk is the importance of the visual culture in all these movements. They are viral and they are all visual. They are all metaphoric. They all use images. They use poetry. They use irony. It's a cultural revolution in the strict sense, in the sense of a new form of communication that impacts people, not with the boring speeches of all the traditional politicians, and completely change the languages in a multimodal way. And that, I think, we have to integrate in the analysis.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I just want to make sure that I understood correctly, because the genesis of that "we are the 99% meme" took a lot of work.
I'm sure it didn't just roll off somebody's,
And so the part of it started several years ago with David DeGraw and Anonymous and "We Are the 99% Social Network, Bite Press Network." And so at Zuccotti, early on, part of the General Assemblies, people got together and said, what is going to be the message of our movement? What are we going to say? And there was a fight with Adbusters about what is our one demand.
Yeah.
And the movement, or the people organizing the movement at that time, decided that they were going to go with this second idea, which is we are the 99%, and they were going to run with that. And so the early pictures are actually fake. They're well, not fake in the sense that they're not real people's stories, but they were generated specifically to create enough content so that the site was buzzworthy when the Occupy Wall Street Twitter went up and you could link, and then you could, people would go and see these stories and then create their own crowd-sourced content. But that site is heavily, heavily curated. That's why it's not trolled, and that's why it appears to us like a pure discursive format, which it's not. For every, I would say at least one picture that goes up, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 10 get thrown away.
Yeah, I'd be surprised because it's such a pure set of statements.
Yeah, but people who put that together are actually, I mean, we kind of joked about this earlier, social media experts, right? Social media consultants, right? That start to create a science of this world that they can then launch these more viral things, so long as they have a handle in the network itself. And so when we think about this thing as being self-organizing, I have a little bit of trouble understanding that as something that's very horizontal, because they're people that make the internet. They're not horizontal.
Right.
So I was wondering if there's a way to account for that when we're talking about the history of a meme itself. And
I think that's a really great point. And I mean, as you were talking, it occurred to me that the irony is that probably a lot more work went into the "we are the 99% idea than went into Rousseau's throwaway line about eating the rich. But after those lines went out into the world, that's when I think I can say eat the rich takes more cultural work to propagate and spread. And it's more likely to hit limits, network boundaries over which it doesn't cross so easily. Whereas once it's off Tumblr and out in the world, however much work it took to get it there and make that site look pristine in a way for that meme. And I don't deny that at all. I mean, I think that's a very interesting story about that part of the life of the meme. But once it's out in the world, it takes relatively little work to pass on, to share, in terms of cultural production. theater, ritual, song, all of the cultural trappings that help memes go across network boundaries so that you become one people under God, indivisible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Yes, culturally congruent. And so that you can jump more boundaries with that meme, I think, once it got launched. But the launching of it is a really interesting story that I think you ought to tell.
I can't help but think of some of the organizing principles. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Joan, where Joan's talking about, the more local concerted controls that happen in organizations, right? And then as Aerosmith or whoever picks it up, they're institutionalizing it. They're giving it legitimacy. And so we see these, these theories playing out and scaling up to this level.
And I think that your point originally is important, that a lot of these memes need to be reworked as they become sort of denigrated, cheapened, commercialized, co-opted. And there's a lot of struggle culturally over the refreshing of memes. And condensational symbols get tired and retired, and new ones come out to take their place. And so I think that this is a part of the process. I mean, I don't know. It could well be that the 99% doesn't have a long life ahead of it, but it's had a pretty good life so far. So if you think about what kind of work you can get out of a meme like that, it's been pretty impressive.
I was just thinking that possibly the comparison between the 99% and the Eat the Rich, maybe Eat the Rich is a bit of a straw man in some ways. I mean, it might be, if you compare this to say the Frankenfoods frame, which my understanding is it's a classic collective action frame. It would be interesting to see how that weighs up against that sort of a frame.
Yeah, I mean, each of these frames, but I guess that they each might entail different kinds of cultural work, more or less.
Cultural work was involved with the Frankenfoods frame. And it was well before social media or social media.
I mean, I don't know the detailed story, but I do know that there were lots of theatrical enactments, drama, dressing up, caricatures, and so on that were produced and then reproduced. And so the genetic or the organic foods people who partnered in the campaign against Starbucks had the Frankenfoods logo as a Starbucks logo. So there's some cultural production that went into associating and boundary crossing with that meme. But again, those are just some simple examples. Last question, then I think we need to. Yeah, because even Nosh is nodding off. So no,
I'm not nodding off. No,
the bus is here.
I think the bus is here.
I think so. I'm sorry, I've kept you way too long.
I mean, can I ask? Or?
Yes,
okay.
of course.
Right, so I would just like to hear you problematize the technology itself in the sense that it potentially lends. So in terms of thinking about the solutions to these problems, and if they are indeed problems that demand collective solutions, to what extent do these social media platforms enable a very neoliberal perspective of if I can just express my own story, I'm somehow contributing to the solution of the problem, as opposed to a truly collective response to these problems?
Wow.
I mean, it's enabling, to my sense, to an extent, enabling a very individualized response, which is you make kind of clear in your presentation, but to what extent is that actually a problem?
I mean, I don't think that sweeping generalizations make sense in terms of addressing that question. I think that there is a danger. I mean, in a way, that's sort of the Morozov challenge, isn't it? It's clicktivism. I mean, if you want to take it down to Gladwell, New Yorker popular culture, and I think that there is maybe a marginal risk in encouraging feel-good clicktivism. On the other hand, I think that large numbers of people who are engaged in many different ways make for sustainability in these protests. And I think that, just to close on this note, it seems to me that there are risks. There's there's two kinds of risks in these things. And the greater risk might well be if those who feel the need to be more confrontational, more radical, develop a more hierarchical, collective framed protest movement, end up isolating themselves from the general public, then I would rather have a few neoliberal feel-good responses in the general public than isolate what's already a thriving movement from the general public. So I guess that's the reaction I have there. Thanks.
Lance, thanks so much.
Thank you.